Interpol is searching farmland in the Ivory Coast, not for illegal crops, but for child labourers. Police are rounding up an army of youngsters who forgo school to provide cheap labour for the world's top producer of the cocoa bean.
I went to school until I was 10 years old, but now that my parents don't have enough money, I go out to work.
In this crackdown, 68 children were rounded up, many of them trafficked from neighbouring countries.
If the child is found to be trafficked or working, we try to find their families. We then engage in mediation to allow the child to return to their biological family.
This is just the tip of the iceberg. Research by Unicef and the International Labour Organization shows the number of underage labourers has increased for the first time in 2 decades. The UN agencies say that in 2000, 246 million children around the world were part of the workforce. International efforts helped reduce that number to 152 million by 2016. But those major gains are being reversed. Activists say that if urgent steps aren't taken, by the end of next year the figure could again surpass 200 million.
Families are desperate and they're turning to child labour as a last resort. We must not accept this. We urge countries to expand income support measures like child benefits to get children back into school where they belong.
The biggest increase is in Sub-Saharan Africa, where nearly a quarter of children aged 5 to 17 are working, as opposed to 2.3% in Europe and North America. The report also shows a rise in the number of young people engaged in hazardous work with heavy machinery. Perhaps the most worrying, the UN says the COVID-19 pandemic could push millions more adolescents into work, and for longer hours under worsening conditions.
They are affected by school closures, lockdowns, lost parental jobs and income, a lack of social safety nets. It's time to get back on track.
The report comes as the leaders of the group of 7 wealthy countries meet to discuss pandemic recovery efforts, including a global vaccination campaign to protect those most vulnerable and plans to get children back to school. The ILO says the data should be a wake-up call to G7 leaders to take meaningful action to prevent a generation from losing their childhood, their education and their safety. Liz Maddock, TRT World.
Let's get more on this with Cornelius Williams in New York. He's Associate Director of Child Protection at Unicef. Welcome to the show. Now, it's a heartbreaking story, of course, and we've seen that numbers are on the rise, but which areas, what countries are most affected?
Thank you very much for having me. You could see from the data, it's countries in Sub-Saharan Africa that is lagging behind. And that's where we're most concerned, because the data shows that progress has not been made in Sub-Saharan Africa. And because actually we all know how badly the economies have been hit in Sub-Saharan Africa and how difficult recovery will take place, for the recovery to take place, we feel that actually the focus should be on those countries.
Now, but most of these countries are, as you also mentioned, among the poorest nations in the world. So when we talk about policy interventions like universal childcare, can these countries really afford to do that?
Indeed, they can, actually. During the COVID pandemic, actually, one of the key response was social protection, cash transfer, which included child benefits, actually, to families. And over 200 countries were able to implement it. It's one of the prescription that the donors actually and the international financial institution are providing to government. So we do believe that the fiscal space is there. We have repeatedly said the fiscal space is there, and this is good investment to invest in children and to make sure that they have this childcare benefit. In addition to that, actually, they already had invested in the education system. Now, what they need to do is to make the education system more efficient by ensuring that these children are not left out when the schools reopen.
Okay, and let's talk about the role of the larger economies, the G7, or even international or multilateral donors. Where do they come in?
They have to make sure that in that package that they are providing, the loans and the grants, that they ensure that they include these measures that we're advocating for. They have to ensure that the education is looking at the most vulnerable and that there are systems in place in this education sector and services to check for children who have dropped out and to bring back these vulnerable children. Coverage needs to be universal, and we need to address the issue of equity. Second, they have to ensure that these packages that they're providing covers actually social protection and child benefit. We are advocating for universal child benefit for these children. And the final point actually in the agricultural sector, as we talk about the agricultural sector, the improvement in the agricultural sector and our food system, they have to ensure that children are not part of the workforce in these sectors.
And very quickly, I must ask you, we know that lockdowns because of the pandemic have worsened this crisis. Do you see the trend now improving as economies reopen, or on the other hand, as demand for many of the raw materials that come out of mines and natural resources coming out of these areas, that this might actually worsen the trend and employ more children in these professions?
Well, actually, the jury is still out there, but the trend we have seen as the demand increase and there is poverty, you take those two together, there's going to be more children working in this hazardous industry.
Clearly, a wake-up call for the world and action needed. Thank you so much, Cornelius Williams, for your input on the show.